Okay, so um I was wondering what woke me up last night with this strong magnetic bliss in the center of the brain in the middle of the night. And I thought, well, maybe it's one of the qigong masters making with me or something. And I it was the magnetic bliss was so strong that I had to go into full lotus to meditate, since I couldn't sleep with that strong magnetic bliss. And then this morning, I was looking at the calendar and I noticed, oh, it's the full moon tomorrow or the next day or something. And as Qigong Master Chen Yulin said, the meditation is 10 times stronger during the full moon. So, what this shows is that when we open up the third eye, the the energy is in control. The universe is what meditates us and not the other way around. That there's this intelligence to reality, and as my last video explained, the secret of Mother Earth um in alchemy is that the the yang qi is the metal in the water, and that's how when you focus on the metal as through sublimation in celibacy, then the water becomes earth, and the fire becomes heaven as yang shen, and by feeding the yin qi back into the water of earth. And so the heart and the kidneys become the sun and the moon, or the heaven and earth. And it's complicated, obviously, but it's a beautiful ancient science and art of reality as alchemy. And so recently, I had corresponded with Dr. Richard Carrier, who he's written several books on the lack of historical evidence for Jesus, and the evidence for Christianity created as a propaganda, um, religious propaganda ideology. And he just did a blog post about Nazism being essentially Christian nationalism. And I wrote a paper on this. I'm gonna link his post in my chat. There we go. I guess his doesn't come up, but okay. Yeah. So anyway, I wrote a paper on this my first year of college. I had just left the Christian's private school that I went to in Minnesota for 7 years. And then I went to Hampshire College, which is a hippie college with no grades, self design study. And I took a class called Art and Literature Between the Wars, about like Weimar Republic in Germany and um, Russia. It was in basically focused on European art and literature between the wars. And yeah, so that's why I wrote a paper about how the Christian church was actually supporting Hitler for the most part. I mean, there was some Christian activists against the Nazis, but overall, the Nazis were a Christian movement. So Richard Carrier cites this book um, that just got released by or published by Oxford Press, and the guy's name's Michael Nilsson, and he gives a talk that I will post here on Christianity and Hitler. And then there's another guy, Alec Ryrie, Ryrie, and he gave a talk on Hitler, Hitler and Jesus. So this is, of course, appropriate because today Don Lemon got arrested for being the journalist in the church covering the protests against the ICE officer in Minnesota who is a pastor. Hello, somebody's actually watching me as I talk. Thanks. Um, Yeah, I mean, I go, I attend a Lutheran church, and so I didn't grow up Lutheran. I grew up Presbyterian, and then I went to this Covenant school. And Covenant is interesting because I didn't realize that Covenant is actually it's a Swedish rebellion against Lutherans, and it's based on the Pietist movement. And I think the Pietists might be related to the Anabaptists, and the Anabaptists were also like a more extreme than Luther because the Anabaptists believed in like personal spirituality and instead of just relying on the Bible. And the Pietists also in the Covenant. I didn't realize the Covenant, they were called evangelicals in Sweden apparently, but I guess I don't know. I think Luther was also considered to be evangelical or something, but so I was confused by all the different denominations and everything. In other words, you could be called like an evangelical church in Minnesota, but you're actually just like an offshoot of the Lutheran church and not really. I mean, it's it's a slippery slope where you all of a sudden you're like far right evangelical Hitler Christian. I mean, so I just read James Kittleson's biography of Luther, and it was recommended to me by a professor who uh, lectured on Luther. He had a whole class on Luther for years, so he's probably like one of the top world's experts on Luther. And he, so I mean, James Kittleson's memoir or biography of Luther, it kind of it glosses over the anti-Semitism aspect of Lutheran. It basically says, well, since Luther was against the Turks and Muslims as much as he was against the Jews, um, he was basically against anybody who wasn't, didn't support his views. So it's okay. But the other thing about Luther it's interesting. It's like he turned like beer drinking beer hall songs into hymn Christian hymns, and which is, if you think about it, that's like a brilliant marketing strategy because it's really the singing that binds the congregation together in my experience. You go to church and you sing the songs and they get stuck in your head all week or at least for a few days. And so yeah, singing in church was a big part of my music experience. In fact, I even played guitar. We One time we went down to the lake and I was singing Christian songs while I played guitar, and for with our youth group, with the confirmation group or whatever. So I was definitely like had an evangelical moment, but then I remember later on there was some kind of evangelical church and they had the kids going down to the lake to convert, to like get people to, what do they make you say you accept Jesus as your savior or whatever. Like you have to say the words or else you're going to go to hell or something. And so I'm just sitting there in full lotus in Padma Asana yoga position at the lake at this time. It's like my these kids are like who I was 30 years ago, or 20 years ago. This would have been 20 years ago for me, and then 80, it would have been 20 years in my past or whatever. Anyway, so yeah, um it's kind of like, well, what do you do? Like if you're sitting in full lotus, then that's considered to be evil by the evangelicals because it's all based on Platonic philosophy. So it's the like what Paul preached was he was against psychic energy, and psychic energy is the lunar energy. And based on Platonic philosophy, you need to go beyond the moon to the solar um energy. But if you really study Pythagorean philosophy, you have to it's like the original Sumerian teaching where the snake is not evil, and you have to in Egyptian alchemy they call it absorbing the crocodile because the crocodile is the water. So that yin chi energy is has to be fed back into the water as the fire under the water in order to build up the secret metal, to heat up the metal in the water as the Mother Earth worshiper. So the moon has to first, like, this is what Gurdjieff taught as the original Christian teaching is that the moon energy has to be embraced and you have to build up the psychic energy first before you can activate the spiritual energy of the sun, and that the moon energy is the foundation, and this is what they call the second chakra. And so in tantra you're stuck in the second chakra as psychic energy. Excuse me. And so this is why you need that extreme like patriarchy for real alchemy, because you have to separate away from the women, the females, to store up your energy. Yeah. Sorry, I got a frog in my throat. Anyway, I in my 2012 book I talked about how I after my enlightenment experience, and I fell out of enlightenment, but then I sat in full lotus in Minneapolis, and my goal was to launch a global revolution out of Minneapolis, and I called this the Natural Resonance Revolution, and I created a pamphlet about it, and then I also called it Etherealized Pranarchy, and that was my joke, Etherealized Pranarchy. So now you have Bovino, the Nazi guy, saying how there are, I think he called them potential anarchists in Minneapolis, which I thought was really funny. It's like, okay, is it like potential energy? Like it's psychic energy anarchists, potential anarchists. Um, and it's like, okay, well, who are anarchists? They're just the original, like in Spain, the original anarchists were celibate, but the reason they were celibate is because they were literally too poor to eat food, and if you can't eat food, then your sex drive like vanishes, basically. Um, so this connection of like an ascetic, sort of like Christian ascetic self poverty as liberation theology and anarchism and all that. I mean, unfortunately, it's it's not necessarily a voluntary thing, but of course now if you're poor, then they consider that to be illegal. Like it's literally illegal to be poor now, so you get targeted for slave private prison labor in the that's what this whole thing really is. I mean, they have like the private prison industry really donated to the Trump fascism regime, which it's literally like, I mean, Trump read Hitler's speeches, and so he's literally copying Hitler's strategies for corporate fascism. And yeah, so I've been really proud of Minneapolis for the huge protests, but I left Minneapolis because I could see the cops were out of control, and people in Minneapolis are saying, yeah, it's not just ICE, it's the whole militarization of police in general. and making it illegal to be poor, and that um, the organizing of the neighborhoods is and the creation of a social service network is really not any different than what happened after World War II, when 35% of the workforce was unionized and the marginal tax rate on the rich was 91% for Eisenhower. And so that's what Tim Walz is pointing out, is that, in Minnesota, there's a progressive tax on the rich. And even my dad was part of that when he was a Republican, but he was a Nelson Rockefeller Republican, which is, at that time, it was like a liberal progressive Republican where you believe in a progressive tax on the rich. And so my dad he worked for the Citizen League as a volunteer. He chaired a report that became the basis of what they called the Minnesota Miracle. And Tim Walz has referenced the Minnesota Miracle recently, for his education, his whole, tax program. Essentially, Minnesota made the cover of Time magazine back in the early 70s, and that was because of the report my dad had shared. And then the guy he worked with, Tom Berg, wrote a book called The Minnesota Miracle. And Tom Berg's son, Jeff Berg, was hanging out at our house, or outside of our house, for various reasons that I won't go into. But and Tom Berg, he's from my mom's hometown. My mom knew his family, growing up, and so it's a small world, essentially, is what it. Tom Berg was a Democratic politician, but also a lawyer, and he worked with my dad, who was a Republican. But then my dad got in trouble because the attorney general my dad was working for as the chief deputy officer, that attorney general, Doug Head, he ran for governor, and so he ran against the platform that my dad had shared as a progressive Republican at the time. And so this was in the early 70s. And so then basically that's when the Powell memo came out to reverse the reforms that Ralph Nader had spearheaded in DC, with the regulation of corporations, the more extreme regulations, for environmental protection and health and safety and all that. And essentially, this goes back to, what is a corporation, how it's defined in terms of being a legal person versus a chartered, uh, when a chartered structure that, is created by the con the state Congress. So that's why the attorney general can revoke a corporate charter and dissolve the charter and put it in a rescindership. Um, so anyway, this is something I sent to the AG